instability in all corners of the globe seems to be one of the themes, and we've also got elections happening, obviously in Europe and the UK, and then of course the mother of all elections that we're going to have later this year. Maybe you could give us a bit of a recap on what's been happening there.
Well, Eugene, you're absolutely right. I don't really know where to start. I'm afraid I'm a bit of a politics junkie, so it's probably not the kind of thing I should admit, because I know there's a few people watching us today, Eugene. But I am fascinated by politics, and I quite happily sit and watch election results for 12 hours non-stop, which was the case with regard to the United Kingdom. But okay, yes, we had very interesting elections in France, very, very interesting elections in the UK. But as you say, the mother of all elections awaits us in November, and I can't wait. However, obviously, all eyes in Washington, in fact, I reckon the eyes of the world, were on 90 Minutes when Donald Trump and Joe Biden had that presidential debate. And I don't know how many of you watching this watched the entire 90 Minutes. I watched it all, and I think it's one of those expressions, what has been seen can't be unseen. And obviously, Joe Biden, the president, had an absolutely appalling debate. Full stop. It doesn't matter whether you like or dislike Joe Biden. It was a complete catastrophe. Since that time, there's been a movement within the Democratic Party itself, amongst the leadership, to ask Joe Biden to step down. But as we know, and I've written about this, in fact, in my Pain report, initially actually in February of this year, there's only one person who will be able to tell Joe Biden to step aside and not contest the US election in November, and that is his wife, Dr. Jill Biden. For the moment, the Biden family are standing firm and basically urging Joe Biden not to withdraw his candidacy. And so that's the state of play in Washington. But a couple of quick observations. First and foremost, I still believe Trump will win the November election. I said that many, many months ago. And the events following the Biden debate debacle has only strengthened my degree of conviction, because as you all know, ignore the national opinion polls. That's not the way the electoral system works in the United States. The president is elected by an electoral college, and therefore you've got to look at the critical battleground states. And obviously, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina are the critical battleground states. And at this moment in time, I have Trump leading in all of the core 7 battleground states. That will secure him a second term in the White House. So don't look at the popular opinion polls. They're irrelevant because of the calculus and the nature of how the Electoral College works. So a couple of very quick observations, Eugene, if I may. If we assume, as I do, that Trump is going to win in November, we've got to brace ourselves for a second Trump term. We know a lot about Trump already. We know that he's going to implement tariffs pretty much across the board, but particularly against China. We know that he will continue a very aggressive fiscal stimulus program. But of course, Biden's already delivered that. Net, I think a Trump presidency will be at the margin inflationary. Also, Trump doesn't like a strong dollar. He thinks that countries that have weak currencies are kind of cheating in terms of their exports. So he doesn't like a strong dollar. Furthermore, he doesn't like high interest rates. Which property developer do you know likes high interest rates? And I believe, and this might be a little bit controversial, I think he'll have a fireside chat with the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, soon after he wins the election in the end of this year. And once he's inaugurated, post January the 20th, 2025, he'll bring in Jerome Powell and he'll ask him to lower rates. I know that might sound a little bit controversial, and I then believe Jerome Powell will resign. If Jerome Powell doesn't resign, I think Trump is going to fire him. So, I'd put that out there, and obviously I'd probably make a fool of myself yet again, having said all of that. So ultimately, I think a Trump presidency would at the margin be somewhat more inflationary and, of course, also very protectionist. So I think we can begin to instill that into our thinking about investment markets. Briefly, the UK, the Labour Party won a landslide. I think they won 411 seats out of a potential 650 in the House of Commons. The Conservatives were completely and utterly wiped out. So obviously Rishi Sunak has stepped aside, and we now look for a new Conservative Party leader. I don't think anyone is rushing to take that poisoned chalice anytime soon. But anyway, suffice to say, we have a massive Labour Party parliamentary majority. One little statistic for those of you who care about elections and politics. Here's one for the record book. 1/3 of the British electorate voted for the Labour Party, and yet the Labour Party won 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. I'll say it again. 1/3 of the electorate voted for the Labour Party, and yet they secured 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. So that's one for the record books. That's never happened before. Quickly across to France. Yes, this is another nation I get pretty excited about when it comes to politics. I used to work for the French. I used to pop across the channel when I worked for Paribas, one of the top French investment banks. We worked there in London for them and popped across to see my colleagues in Paris. Very pleasant as well. Lovely little bars and restaurants in Paris. And so I've got quite an affection for all things French. And one thing I learned very early on working for the French was that you have to be French to understand French politics. It is the most confusing and complex political system in the world. Anyway, we had the second round on Sunday, the parliamentary elections. If you remember, Emmanuel Macron, devastated all of us by dropping this bombshell, calling an early election for Parliament. And the first round, Marine Le Pen and the National Rally, won the largest amount of votes. Then everyone ganged up on Marine Le Pen and her party, and we saw this remarkable outcome. The new Popular Front, which was a brand new grouping that was a coalition of the Greens, the Socialists, the Communists, and none other than Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who I hope you are all very familiar with, would make a communist look moderate. He is probably the most radical politician that we've seen in France for many, 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 many decades. And now Mélenchon is, heaven forbid, I shouldn't say that, should I? I shouldn't say heaven forbid. It sounds like I don't approve of Mélenchon. But I mean, let me just say this. Even the members of his own party don't like him. No one in his coalition likes him. They are all terrified of him. So he will not be the next premier of France. But the bottom line is France now faces a period of instability as we approach the Paris Olympics. And I'm not really sure where this is going to go, but I'm afraid these are the things we need to think about very carefully. France is a key foundation of the European Monetary Union. France also has horrible fiscal and budgetary arithmetic. The French government debt to GDP ratio is 110%. The budget deficit is 5.5%. They have breached all of the criteria for membership of the European Monetary Union. But of course, they got away with it because they're French. So moving forward, the EU is now looking to discipline France and have actually issued a proclamation only 2 weeks ago saying that France has to reduce its budget deficit. Let me tell you right now, if the European Union goes to Jean-Luc Mélenchon, a diehard communist Trotskyite, and tells him to reduce debt, he will tear the piece of paper up in front of their face, because his fiscal agenda is to significantly increase debt. So basically, the French capital markets now are having to try and understand and recalibrate and try and get a sense of what is going to be the outcome. Who's the premier, the prime minister of France going to be? Because we haven't made a decision on that yet. And how much power will Mélenchon and some of the radical left have in this new parliament? So it's a really interesting situation right now. I better stop there, Eugene, because you can
Yes.
see I'm getting overexcited.
Sounds like a complicated mess, really, in Europe. And it's interesting. It's interesting what you were saying about the U.S. election. We've talked, and there's been a lot of public commentary of people um, who feel that, and I think you're in this camp as well, that uh, Jerome Powell wants to cut rates to try to reduce the odds of Trump winning the election.